Hi everybody. Go check out my friends at Sonic Science CBD. They're a full spectrum hemp-based CBD manufacturer out of Renton, Washington that produce phytocannabinoid rich products using the entire hemp plant using pharmaceutical based CO2 extraction techniques. CBD, for those of you who don't know, is a non intoxicating remedy for chronic pain, anxiety, insomnia, and other inflammatory conditions. Sonic Science makes tinctures, topicals, flower products, and even pre workout, which is my personal favorite. Go check out their Facebook group, Sonic Science CBD, to learn more. Also, check out episode 8 of the Roscoe's Wetsuit podcast, in which I interview Sonic Science CBD CEO and founder Tim McDougall.
All right, welcome to another episode of the Roscoe's Wetsuit podcast. I am here today with my good friend, Sam Tullman. Sam, how's it going?
Hey man, it's going great. It's
Good.
really fun to be on here with you. Super excited about this Roscoe's Wetsuit endeavor that you're diving into. And yeah, I'm
Glad to
happy
have
we get
you.
to talk. It's a nice excuse to talk. Catch up.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's been a while. Too long. But yeah, Sam is a really interesting guy. We met about probably a year and a half ago now, was it? Um, Basically at a company that we both used to work at, and ended up being roommates and friends and coworkers, a lot of different things. But
Some
yeah,
of those we did better than others.
so yeah, differing levels of success. Indeed. But Sam's a super interesting guy. He has a kind of a wide array of interests. As far as he did in school, he graduated from the University of Pennsylvania with a Bachelor's of Arts in Neurobiology and Neurosciences, also playing college football at the same time. He was a research assistant at the Northwestern University Department of Psychology, undergraduate research assistant at the Center of Sleep, and he has been the lead QEEG technician at the PTSD Institute in Seattle now, doing some really cool research on, I believe, prisoners on death row. Is that correct?
Yeah, largely. Absolutely.
Awesome. Well, that should be really interesting. We'll definitely get into that on the
Yeah.
podcast today. But I want to start off just by kind of asking, how did you get into this whole, neuroscience thing? I know we've talked, somewhat about it,
Ooh.
but as far as like, when it came to college and you decided, okay, I'm going to study neuroscience, was it a clear like, okay, I'm going to do this, or was it more like figuring out what you were interested in and then kind of falling into it, or how did that
Yeah,
work?
yeah. Super good question. It comes at a good time because I have been doing a lot of writing for an application for a Fulbright scholarship, which I'm kind of done now and waiting to hear back from. So fingers crossed. But I kind of have been discussing just this. So yeah, coming out of high school, I had an interest in human behavior, I think is probably the biggest thing. And I had really excelled in high school in the natural sciences. Taken various APs, blah blah blah, all the nice high school accolades. And I had considered neuroscience. I thought that would be cool. I had been a little bit frustrated by psychology, and I say this kind of, and it's interesting to hear myself say this because in a way I've come back full circle on it. But at the time, I was like, man, what are all these theories that people have that are like just based on like watching their kids? Like, that's crazy. Are you kidding me? Like, we can't think of anything more scientific. So, I had this mind for neuroscience. And then I think it was when I took the kind of intro course that Penn has into their neuroscience program, which is biological basis of behavior. And it was the first experience I had ever had of being like really, really challenged by a class. And I had been challenged by classes before, but not to the extent that I was like, and this sounds, ridiculous and very like school and academic, but like not to the extent that I wasn't going to get an A, basically. And here I was like working my butt off, and I probably was not going to get an A, and I didn't. And I just remember being like so challenged and so fascinated by it. And that was kind of when I knew. I would say, to say a little bit about myself, the interest in behavior came from a variety, came from a family background where I saw kind of a lot of erratic behavior, which, for the sake of my family, I won't go too much into here, but I had some crazy times growing up in my household. And then also being diagnosed with type 1 diabetes and recognizing the like change in my own behavior that was occurring with changes in blood sugar. So it really, and there's many other influences, but I'd say those two things kind of made me aware of like, oh, what's going on? Like, why are people so crazy, including myself? Why are we all acting so crazy, so irrational? And I wanted to understand it more. So I'd say that's kind of how I went into that rabbit hole where I find myself now.
So it was like partially kind of like a personal interest as far as like trying to figure out, what's going on, with me, what's going on with, how I'm kind of creating my world and what's going on with all these weirdos out here.
Yeah, totally. Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, that's really interesting. Yeah, I kind of like, we probably talked and I've followed a somewhat similar path, but I'm with you there as far as at times getting disillusioned with psychology in terms of it, when it's focused more so on the theories of trying to, rationalize why all this stuff happens. And I kind of gravitated towards more like, okay, well, maybe this is true, maybe it isn't, but it's like, here are the here's the chemicals and electrical, patterns that the brain is, and these chemical and electrical messengers that the brain is using. It's like, here we can actually quantify that.
Right. And well, it feels like there's certainty in that. And I guess that's why I say that I've come back full circle. Because there is some level of knowledge or knowing in that, which is great and it's important and has the potential to do a lot of good. And we're really, honestly, we're in the early stages of it just starting to do good. And a lot of that technology where we can see some of these things has been around for a while. And we're kind of, even now, just figuring out how it's useful. Like mental health care is super, super behind in how it takes care of people and how it looks at illness. So that's, we can get into that later. That's a big passion of mine. But all that to say that it feels like there's that level of certainty when you're like, oh, I know what molecule is being released.
Right.
But it's like, you don't really know that much more, because you could have said before, okay, we're going to say X molecule, and now you have a name for it, and it's connected to maybe some other process. But I think the risk that both you and I saw at the place that we were coworkers together is that there can sometimes be a false sense of certainty or a false sense of security in that quote unquote knowing. It's like, okay, great. Like 10% of what's going on now, but don't act like 100%, because that's dangerous and irresponsible.
Right.
And I think that also happens.
Yeah, I feel like that's a big problem with like integrating this stuff into a business where it's like, as a marketer, you don't want to convey that you're 10% sure about a product. Like that's the problem I see is like, you want to be able to like speak about something with 100% confidence in business, but it's like, realistically speaking, we can't be 100% confident about this stuff when it pertains to the brain. And there's definitely, I guess trying to be as honest with people as possible. I think, people definitely respect that, but there is so much we still don't know as far as, the brain and all of these things. It's like you keep, at the surface level, maybe they're somewhat complex, but if you try to actually go and really understand all these mechanisms, it seems like it just gets more and more complicated.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, actually, and I appreciate that you brought up the business thing. I think there's two things there. One thing that we both kind of have experienced from having some interaction or background with biohacking is the idea of like, do what works, which I think there's definitely some wisdom in. And again, it's risky. Like, you have to start thinking about, okay, and what does that mean if it works? And is it repeatable? And does it work for other people? And what's happening at the tail end? So there's all of that, which is connected to the business. And then there's all of the, like, how do you get some of these applications to people in a simple way that makes sense? Because like you were saying, it's not that simple. Like, I recently read a slide deck on behalf of a venture capital firm for a company that's kind of doing some work relating to it's in line with neurofeedback, I would say, but it's using it's responsive to EEG. It's responsive to the kind of brain activity, the electrical activity in someone's brain, to help induce sleep states, which is great. And it's like, man, like, this could have been out way sooner. As you or I both know, it doesn't take much time of putting somebody in like slow wave neurofeedback to put them right to sleep, you know? That's a pretty quick process. But also there's complications of like bringing that to a mass market. So yeah, it's always things to be careful with. And I think for me, from the business perspective, what makes the biggest difference, because there's all sorts of actions that can be taken, but what will make the biggest difference is where the intention is. And that might not come through in one single action or another single action, but overall it comes through in the direction that a company is going. So like, if if this company has the intention to make a lot of money, they're going to say, yeah, just slap that thing on your forehead. You'll be like sleeping great in no time. Don't worry about anything. And if it doesn't work, it's your fault. Or if you start feeling weird things, we don't know anything about it. Whereas if the priority is like, let's help people, and we're helping people by this product, then sure, we might still put it out there and say, yeah, slap that thing on your forehead. But there might be a little different kind of tone to it, and there might be a little different level of care and follow-up, which I think is the most important.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I think, honestly, I personally trust products and people who are creating these products more so who have the background in neuroscience first, before they jump into business. If it's business people who are interested in neuroscience, I think there can be a lot of, complications. Not to say that there can't be the other way around, but well, as far as when it comes to, kind of, you alluded to neurofeedback, which is one of the ways that we can kind of, alter or kind of basically teach people how to regulate their own brain activity in these different electrical frequencies. What have you seen as far as, there's some people will, try to use the excuse, oh, this stuff is, there's no research on, but which isn't true. We know there is research. There may not be enough like peer-reviewed, perfect research that is able to be done with, say, pharmaceutical drugs because of, lack of funding. But
Sure.
as far as, you've been trained in how to read the research and with your studies and so what do you see as far as the different technologies, the different kind of transcranial stimulation and neurofeedback and these things for different ailments? What do you see right now as far as what do we know that there's a decent possibility that actually works?
Yeah. Okay, this is great. It's a big question, actually. So I would say, I think you mentioned already, there's first of all, there is research related to neurofeedback that actually this can work, and it can work quite well in very specific circumstances. And then even outside of some of that research, there's still documented, not academic, but documented success in a lot of different areas. Always something to be cautious with when it's not kind of having to be published and reviewed by a lot of people. But still, as you and I saw, people can do quite interesting things with that technology. And it seems to be quite useful. And I think the medical field is starting to catch on and open up to it a little more. And I think that's starting with just using EEG. So it's starting with just using it as a diagnostic more and more, which is happening. And then perhaps that will develop into a little more acceptance of neurofeedback. Because at the end of the day, and this is kind of where my passion lies, and this relates back to that kind of biohacking-esque creed, which is really much older than biohacking. That may be the last time I mentioned biohacking, unless you say something about it for my own sake. But which is that activity changing in the brain, and you know you're doing one or two things. Well, if you're working with a patient from a clinician's perspective, it's like, let's keep doing that, especially when they're low risk. Now, we're actually much earlier on in some of the stimulation, which is not to say it's bad. And the military especially has done some very, very interesting studies, especially on transcranial AC and DC. And I myself have played with this technology. Again, it can be very interesting. It can induce some very powerful changes, normally short-term in the brain. And I'll talk about that in a minute as well. But I think something to be careful with. Something to be careful with as always, because you don't really know what's going on in the back end. All of this stuff in the scheme of history is quite new. So you see me wearing my robes, and I know at some point you will probably ask about where I'm going next and where I'm living right now. But there are certain practices that people have been doing for hundreds or thousands of years, and you can kind of see how or in what ways it's worked out. And you can also see the pitfalls. You can see where it hasn't quite worked out. But that's good data. Whereas the more and more recent you get, it's like, wow, okay, that has some really powerful effects. That's very cool. How do we use it cautiously? Or how do we start to integrate it? Or how do we investigate it?
Yeah, I think for me, I mean, the biggest thing is making sure that you're putting it in the right hands, because this is definitely like super powerful technology. And I've said, on the podcast before, it's like, I feel like it's like any tool, it's like with a hammer or something, you could use it to either build a house or knock yourself out, you could hit yourself in the head with it. Like, it's just a tool. So it's like,
or even easier to knock somebody else out.
Or to not, yeah.
In the case of both the technology and the hammer, right?
There you go. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, it's something that we know. I mean, with neurofeedback, you can definitely take someone, you can make their brain worse, if you don't know what you're doing with that sort of tool. And I think even more so with the stimulation potentially, just because, I mean, it is more so actually, giving an external kind of output or input rather to the brain, rather than the neurofeedback is kind of just telling the brain what's going on. Whereas with the stimulation, you're actually feeding electrical current. But yeah, I mean, I mean, I agree with you. It's cool to be on this forefront, and I think maybe me and you both have that kind of in common, that we're very curious about these sort of tools, and it's kind of irresistible not to like play around with them, right?
Yeah, well, and to figure out how they can be used effectively. And I think like one of the things that we can touch on in that note is like what effective looks like and what you're trying to get out of it. Because in almost any circumstance, I think we're still always looking for shortcuts. And I think people in the field not to be named are often looking for shortcuts. And it's good to find the most efficient way. Don't get me wrong. Like, it's very good to find the most efficient path. And shortcuts are shortcuts for a reason. And there's often important things that are missed. So when it comes to synaptic plasticity, there really are very few shortcuts. There's some ways that you can create more of an impact on what your brain is taking in, for sure. But at the end of the day, synaptic plasticity requires repeated exposure, unless it's something particularly traumatic, God forbid. But otherwise, if we're talking about training or changing the brain or changing the body, really in any circumstance, any type of plasticity, it requires repeated action. And I think then you start to ask, okay, well, sure, I know what this does when I, hook up kind of negative to this side of my head and like positive on this shoulder. I know it happens once. It's quite cool. I get in a really deep meditation. But what happens when I do it 100 times? Will I start having difficulty like making plans with my friends? Mm-hmm. So what can be practiced? What can be practiced? And for what can't be practiced, what can be actually taken from what we like learn and develop during that time as something that's useful for regular life?
Right. Absolutely. Yeah, it's something I think you maybe touched on it a little bit as far as, with something like the stimulation and it being, potentially some people think of it as a shortcut, and there's definitely the perception. I mean, we both have probably experienced that from either patients or clients where, there's the perception that this is kind of like the holy grail, that we have this kind of like secret technology that, and not to say that it's not powerful and that it can't really dramatically improve people's lives, but at the same time, I kind of view it as like it's kind of, I mean, going back to like kind of a tool in the tool belt where stuff like exercise or meditation, eating a healthy diet, all these things are super basic, but very well researched, and we probably have better research just on getting good quality sleep. That I think that's one of the like most profound. Yeah. Well, you were working right in a sleep lab, so yeah. But I'm curious. You had alluded to some of these older practices that kind of we may know some more about, and we've followed people who've done them. And I know you personally are a practitioner of meditation and Zen. And I'm curious as far as kind of you've definitely dug deeper than I think a lot of people. A lot of people out there, I feel like, they've tried to meditate at this point. Meditation's such a popular topic nowadays where people have tried to meditate. Their mind probably races. They probably have a hard time doing it. But you're someone who's actually crazy enough to do these multi-day retreats and actually
crazy is required.
Crazy is required, and actually sit in silence and on hard floor and with your knees given out, right? Like, and from what you've told me about it, it sounds like very intense experiences.
Yeah, it is. I can say a little bit about that. I don't know what was the giveaway that I was doing intense meditation. It wasn't the costume that I'm wearing. No. What to say about that? Well, perhaps the way that I got into that, which this wasn't necessarily like the intention from the beginning. Although, when I was young, I didn't really know what I was doing, but I was trying to meditate, and I practiced Shotokan karate, and I was very fortunate that my sensei growing up actually did have us do a little bit of meditation, but it didn't become part of my life or anything. It was like, a minute or two of meditation at the beginning and at the end of class. And I didn't have a kind of framework to put it in. And then kind of got lost and carried away into all these other things in life. Became good at football, and that kind of took over my life, and that was very good to me. And then it wasn't until I was in college and I was really dealing with the fact that I, first of all, thought I wasn't good enough, and on some level was not good enough to really play and play well and play a lot at the Division I level. And at a certain point reached a breaking point and was very fortunate to find a mentor who basically helped me rework a number of my life habits. And this is a shout out to Nii Shobumain. Maybe, I don't know how this will work, but I can always send you a link to his info.
Yeah, I can put
his organization is
I'm
Not You. Yeah, his organization is I'm Not You, so we can put that.
Absolutely.
but I was very fortunate to encounter him at this very right moment. And he basically, and it wasn't just him, I was already beginning to make some pretty major life changes, including with my diet. But he was like, look, like if there's nothing else you do, like you have to start meditating. And it was just on an app at that time. I was on Headspace for a while, and Headspace was amazing. It was perfect for me. And I kind of made it part of my morning routine. And the only reason I did it was because I was like I'm going to be good for, you know, like I'm going to like no other, or I thought I was meditating like no other. And that I was so kind of focused and in on it, because to me it meant success in football for so long. And that was kind of my entry, my real entry or my re-entry, I would say. And when football was over, that led me down this very interesting path of realizing actually like this seems to be the more important thing here. Actually, like I'm really glad that football led me to this, and this is what I'm actually more curious about exploring. I went to India for a few months after graduating, stayed in some ashrams there, was traveling a little bit. And I also, this whole time during college, I also was studying like South Asian culture and studies, which has its own background. But basically, when I got back, I was kind of consulting with a really good friend of mine who's like a sister to me. And she pointed out to me, she was like, hey, you know that meditation thing that you're doing? And she was a meditator, so it wasn't like she was somebody disparaging it. But she was like, that's really just like another proxy for being a perfectionist, for your perfectionist habit. Not in general, but for the perfectionist habit that you have. And I was like, as soon as she said it, I knew instantly, like it was completely true. Like it had nothing to do with anything else. It was just about me being kind of this perfect image of a person or something. So I stopped meditating for a few months. And, you know,
You're back?
hey, we back?
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
You're good.
So where did you lose me at?
Yeah, you were describing your friend.
Yeah, she basically was like, you know, saying that this was a proxy for my perfectionism. So I stopped meditating. And it wasn't until I reached kind of another turning point in my life, with a relationship ending, and kind of ending for good. It kind of been a back and forth period. And at that very moment, again, a very right moment, something showed up for me. And that was, basically I was staying with some family friends, and they're like, oh, you work at a place called, you know, 40 Years of Zen. And oh, Zen, like our daughter-in-law, she goes and meditates at a Zen center. And I was like this close to being like, oh, no, that's not really it. That's not what it's about. And then I was like, you know what? Just go. Like this conversation happened in my mind. So I went with her. And we got up kind of 5 a.m. one morning, and we came to the temple, and it's a Zen temple and practice center. And as soon as I walked in and sat down, I was like, this is it. This is it. Like, this is where I need to be. And then it was something about the smell of the incense and the Japanese culture, which I had kind of immersed myself in before. The way that everything was done, everything was very kind of exacting, and that was familiar to me from probably my athletic career, among other things. And I only really fell more in love with it as time went on, as I started learning more about the teachings in this specific tradition, Rinzai Zen. You know, like my teacher would be giving talks, and all of a sudden I would be like, wait, what? Like, that's what I've been thinking this whole time. You know, not to say that I'm some like enlightened being or Buddha or something, but also we all are. And to have somebody speak something out loud that instantly resonated with some very, very deep realizations that I had had in my life thus far was extraordinarily validating that I was in the right place. And then I really, really appreciated the efforts that this specific community was making to be of service to the larger community, and to be mindful of how it was interacting with people of all sorts of different identities, and to be inclusive and to provide for different parts of the community in ways that it could. So that all kind of led me to this moment. And then all of that happened, and I would say more fuel for the fire. There were two things. The first thing was just all of the reading and research that I had done on meditators at this point. And I had already been meditating at this point, so it's not really what got me in, but it was like a little extra fuel for the fire of seeing, like, first of all, it does make a big change in your brain. Seems pretty darn clear now. There's some pronounced changes that occur over long periods of meditation. So that was very inspiring. And second of all, that one of the most important things about that, which also this tradition, both science and this tradition kind of hold this to be very important, are these kind of intensive experiences or retreat experiences. That those are kind of where some of the biggest changes can occur in the brain, which is consistent with this tradition traditionally holding people to do 4 retreats a year. Although, you know, in our culture nowadays, you know, people often do less and people do as much as they can. But that kind of dropped me into this. That dropped me into this world of pain and discomfort, and all sorts of madness.
Yeah. And you know what's interesting? I mean, I had previously, you know, definitely read a fair amount of meditation. I hadn't, like, you know, dove super deep on the subject, but one of the things that you kind of enlightened me to was what you were kind of mentioning about there's actually a lot better research on this, on, you know, kind of these longer term retreats, as compared to, say, meditating for 20 minutes every single day. That was something that when you first said that, I was really surprised by. But then after going through the research, it seems to be true.
Yeah, and there's research on both. There's kind of 3 different categories of research. The first is the categories of people that have been taught in more the first way that you were talking about, of like, okay, do your 20 minutes of practice a day for a few weeks. And remarkably, even over the period of a few weeks, you can see changes in the brain. And that's really cool. Now, it's another question to say, would those stick then if you stop the practice? Likely not. But still, pretty remarkable to see that as opposed to controls, you do see a lot of these changes that are then correlated with behaviors of better attention, better emotional regulation, among many other things. So that's kind of the first category. Second category is what you were talking about, which is like retreat experience. And that seems to have a huge impact, especially in the way that the emotional system is connecting to the somatosensory system. Because as you mentioned, things get pretty uncomfortable and painful. All sorts of things about how the default mode network, which is kind of this central network of the brain that you could think of as deciding kind of our base functioning, who we are or how we behave at a base level, our kind of standard quote unquote self. And it's a little more complicated than that, but that's one way of thinking about it. So changes in that. And then there's the third kind of category that you can make. There's all sorts of ways to categorize the research, but third category would be lifetime meditators. And that's where you see the most pronounced change and the most stunning, like, wow. And, you know, to make another comment about this, actually, another big moment of of inspiration for me was, I was early in the practice, and about this. I can't remember if this was before or after you had come on. I think it was before, where my Zen teacher, Genjo Roshi, actually agreed to have some recordings done of his electrical activity of his brain while he was kind of doing different, while he was going into different kind of mental states, you could think of them as. We'd call them different forms of samadhi. And even at a base level, not doing it, the changes were remarkable. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a second, and then seeing the impact of going into, I think there were maybe 7 different kind of states that he went into, and just seeing like the changes that were going in there was quite inspiring and quite impactful for me. I remember one moment I was like, I didn't want to disturb him, getting into these very deep states in a brief period of time. So I was kind of stepping out, and I asked him, like, what's the best way for me to like get in and out of the room, and like to kind of usher you in and out of a meditation without someone just saying like, hey, it's over. And he just so honestly, he was like, don't worry, like there's nothing you could do to disturb me. Like there's nothing you could possibly do to disturb me. And I was like, that was honest. Like that wasn't like a polite thing. That was honesty. And I was like, oh wow, powerful.
I'm really glad that you brought him up. I wanted to ask you a little about, your experiences with him. I'll first say my own kind of personal experience. I remember when you first, and that was before I started the company, where you did these kind of electrical recordings on him. But I remember, you telling me about them, when I had joined on, and I remember, my first initial kind of reaction was honestly like, oh yeah, like who's this guy? Like who's this guy to, say he can do this different stuff, and like, there's a lot of people who are, kind of say, oh, we live in a very, I think, like narcissistic sort of society where everyone's kind of claiming they're the shit, they're the top, they're the best. But what was super interesting to me, rampant. Yeah, what was super interesting to me was actually when Genpo, when he came,
Genjo. And I only make that correction because there was another person that came.
Yes,
of that
name. Yes, Genjo.
I won't say anything about, but it was a little different.
Right.
Suffice it to say.
Right. But when Genjo, yes, thanks for the correction. When he came, and spoke to us that one day, it was so interesting to me. I mean, just to see, I mean, what he was talking about was interesting too, but just kind of observing his mannerisms and how, he was not at all, he was actually, I tell people like when you were kind of introducing himself, he was almost embarrassed, it seemed like, when you were like a little bit like, when you were kind of talking about his accomplishments, he was like that humble, where he was like, no, like, no, I'm just like a regular guy, like, don't, like, and I just thought,
and that's honest.
Yeah,
honest.
yeah. I just thought, it's so, it was so different than I guess maybe what I had expected, and I don't know, just a lot of things in his mannerisms kind of caught my attention, just how present he was with everyone, and how he really took a moment to like consider our questions, really, like, he was like silent, right, or like for a few seconds or 10 seconds, and it wasn't
very normal in this practice. Yeah.
But I'm just curious, as far as, you've I had just that one experience, learning a tiny sliver of his knowledge, but what he's kind of, would you say he's kind of served as sort of a mentor to you, or he's served some kind of teacher
and
role in your life, right?
Without a doubt. And it's interesting that we bring up kind of what vocabulary or semantics you would use. And it's developing and changing now that I live here. So the other piece that I think we haven't mentioned yet is that I've been traveling for the last few months, and I just moved back, and I'm actually living as part of kind of the community that is kind of more involved and hands-on with the temple. And I'm right above. So in about 15 minutes, I'm going to go down and kind of open the place up for an evening sit and make some tea for people. But yes, absolutely. And I, you know, at this moment, I would say teacher is probably the most, in a way, endearing and respectful and formal and informal. You know, it's like it captures a little bit of the everything of the relationship, and it's complex, but it's really wonderful and enriching and inspiring for me.
Mm-hmm. Well, like what sort of things have you, whether it be stuff that he's directly said to you or the group, or just things that you've observed and been like, oh, like, you know, just seeing the way he kind of moves, you know, moves through life and the way he
Sure.
does his stuff. What kind of things have been like the biggest sort of like, oh yeah, he really has been, you know, meditating, you know, however
Yeah.
long he has.
Yeah. Well, okay, I'll say a couple things then. The first thing, as far as things that he said, of course, so many moments of like, wow, I'm really going to stop and think about that. And it's hard to even place one. But also, our tradition, the Zen tradition, does not place a big emphasis on words. Silence is quite important, as with most meditation traditions. But in this one, I think particularly silence is really a big theme. So there are the talks that he gives, and I'll also make a plug for that. If you do listen to podcasts or you like to listen to talks or podcasts in the car, and we'll type this out maybe in the description, but the Choboji, Choboji, Temple podcast has all of his talks, some talks from other teachers, but mostly the talks that he has during retreats or other occasions. And I mean, so many of those have just touched a very deep place. And then, you know, I get to have kind of one-on-one meetings and interviews with him and kind of look into my progress and what I'm thinking about, whatever koans, which are kind of like these meditation questions that I have at that moment. But what you said about the action was, I think, very spot on, which is that even more been very, very humbled, astounded, impressed by what action is taking. Because like words are great, and it's an important thing to have the words. I think it's really important. It touches a different place, but they become a lot cheaper if there's not action to match it. And I think in this case, his action goes above and beyond. Like, for example, simply the fact that he is there at pretty much every single sit that is held at this temple every single week, morning and evening. And he's definitely the only person that goes to every single one, first of all. Second of all, just traditionally, that's unheard of. The Roshi, or the head teacher, sometimes they would be an Osho, would never sit at all of the sits, but he's sitting at all the sits because he's very adamant about, no, I need this practice too. This is, you know, this is an important part of my life too, and this community is important. So there's that. But really, something that stuck out to me at this last retreat that I just walked upstairs from, but a couple of days ago, was seeing how dynamic he was with his relationships. And I was kind of marveling at this with another student of like, it's so incredible to realize that he has a special way of kind of touching each person in the community. And sure, I'm sure there's some people, as with any human being, maybe there's some people that, you know, I'm not saying like, oh, everybody needs to come have this beautiful human being as their teacher, but I am saying in what I've witnessed within the community, it's really beautiful to see all of the varied relationships that he has with different people. With me, he has one specific relationship that is a way of reaching me. But with somebody else, it's kind of different, you know, like, and it's all honest and it's all genuine, because he has a full understanding and acceptance of the full range of himself, such that he can interact with a very wide range of people in quite a remarkable way. And it's, you know, it's something I've been practicing here for, let's see, how long now? Almost 2 years now. And it's not something I caught on to right away, but being around more and more, you start to realize, oh wow, like that was very, like, that person's perception or that person's relationship with him is I'm not like comfortable or salty or something about that at all. But it's very, whoa, like he's really meeting each person where they're at. And that's really, really a beautiful thing to witness.
Interesting. Yeah, that's something I feel like people who are like the most gifted at, you know, kind of whether it's managing or just networking, you know, in general, it's like it's being able to, as you kind of you kind of said it better than I could, like kind of, you know, connecting with people the way that they need to be connected with, you know, like there's different sort of modes that you're going to interact with one person, you know, and there may be one kind of strategy you may want to be kind of like, you know, like as say a coach, you may want to be kind of like tougher on one person because you know they can handle it and they kind of like need that sort of like force to kind of like, you know, get them to do what you want. But then someone else, like there might be a different sort of, you know, approach that could be more effective. I don't know if we ever talked about this. I was reading John Wooden's autobiography, the UCLA head coach, head basketball coach, and that was a lot of the stuff he was talking about was like just kind of over time what made him so successful with his teams was just understanding just the varied dynamics of his players, how they were all, you know, I mean, some of them were, you know, rich kids from Beverly Hills and some were, you know, from poverty and it was like wherever they were, you know, and whatever kind of backgrounds they had, it was like, you know, they ended up like realizing like this guy has my back, you know, this guy completely believes in me, supports me. And I think like not a lot of people like, unfortunately, it's like I feel like there's not a lot of people we can say that about sometimes where we're like, but it's super
I mean,
cool and
well, another mentor of mine would have put it this way, by saying like, how do you make everybody feel safe? And some people don't like that word. Some people are like, oh, safe, you know, like, what is this, like some soft thing? But at the end of the day, from a nervous system perspective, that's really what it is. It's like, how do you make each person feel really at ease? How do you make them kind of drop a little bit? Very subtle, but it really is affecting, when you think from a neuroscience perspective, it's affecting the sympathetic parasympathetic balance. And whatever it is, and different people need different things to get there. And to be perceptive and aware and mindful enough, and aware enough of the things that are coming up within your own self, then you can kind of do that for more people. You can allow more people to be safe. You can't make someone feel safe. You can allow them. You can invite them to feel safe. And that's a really, really cool, beautiful thing. It's a great gift to the world.
Interesting. So you think it kind of like starts with kind of figuring some of your own stuff out, like getting more kind of comfortable with yourself before you can sort of have that space to provide that for other people?
I would say so. I think I've actually, you know, to have another quote of when we were doing the brain recording of my teacher, Genjo Roshi, you know, we went through all these different samadhis and they were very cool. They had like, you know, we were describing them in very cool ways, like, you know, like kind of more of a bodhicitta, like a heart mind, compassion oriented samadhi, or kind of more of a mu, like full emptiness, black before black kind of samadhi, and among others. And then the last one he did was the combustion samadhi. And he was like, the combustion samadhi. And I was like, oh God, like, do I have to get under the table? Like, are you going to blow something up? He's like, the combustion samadhi actually is when you go deep internal and you really face kind of the most difficult things that you hold with yourself that there are to face. Whether that's your kind of shames about the past, or your deep anger or hatred, or feelings of betrayal, or your greatest sorrows or nightmares, fears, whatever. But these kind of difficult things that we all do hold with us at varying levels of awareness. And we kind of peel those back like an onion. But he was like, this is probably the most important space to go into out of all of them. Because if you don't spend time here, just sitting and breathing and understanding and seeing some of these things that you do have in yourself and you actually carry around everywhere, then it makes it very difficult to be in any other space in a kind of stable way. And that especially is interpersonal. One thing, like kind of the most interesting thing that I learned from a social neuroscience course that I took was interpersonal interactions are like this like echo chamber of mental health and of mental functioning, right? Like sometimes we can function on our own just well, and you see this over and over with all sorts of people. We can function on our own just well, and we kind of figure out just how we need things to be just so in order to not disturb us. But it's totally a different matter when you add another person to the equation, because you start not being able to control things. And then you're getting feedback from the other person, and it starts playing on what's already in your mind. So it's very important to kind of face and consider some of these things.
And I feel like what's so interesting about that, just to kind of say something real quick before we wrap up, because I know you gotta get down and go downstairs and continue your practice. But it's interesting
Always
to me.
going.
I mean, it's interesting to me how a lot of the stuff, kind of reading social cues, like we know that, the verbal, what's actually said from one person to another, that's like a very small percentage of social interaction. And what you made me first think of is how, say meeting a new person for the first time, oftentimes like I'll just, have, meet them and then like start either like feeling like, like really good and like I'm like feeding off their like positive energy, or like I'm like feeling kind of like weird about like there's like, as you were saying, like there's definitely people who are like can kind of bring out your insecurities, or kind of help you grow, but it is, as you're saying, kind of all reflecting, I guess, their own kind of personal mental state, what they're bringing to that interaction.
Yes.
Well,
it's a sound chamber.
Yes.
Sound chamber. And what are we adding to the sound chamber? I think maybe that's a good question to leave off with.
Yeah.
Is everyone has their own little sound chamber going, and it's a natural part of being a person. And what are we throwing into other people's sound chambers, and what are we throwing into our own sound chambers? And if it's not good, how do we go about changing that?
Absolutely, a good question indeed, and something people can think about in the meantime. And we're gonna do a part 2 of this this podcast, and we're gonna get into your role in doing these kind of electrical studies of the brain with people on death row, which is super fascinating and crazy. But if you want to follow I don't know if you want to promote. You already put a couple things out there.
I mean, you could have my Instagram on there. I'm not super active on social media, but my Instagram is second cocoon, like the number 2, second cocoon, like what a butterfly emerges from. I'll let you interpret the metaphor if you like. That's about it.
Cool. Well, the Roscoe's Wetsuit Podcast, it's Roscoe's Wetsuit Podcast. That is the Instagram. We're on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio now. And then if you actually want to watch the video form of the interview, you can go to YouTube. Roscoe's Wetsuit is the YouTube channel. Go ahead, like and subscribe. You know what to do. So Sam, thanks so much again for being on the show, and enjoy your sit tonight.
Thanks, Toby. Nice to see you, man.
Nice to see you too. We'll talk soon.
Cool. Can't wait.